Hello, I'm Mark Simon. This is our live stream of election 2024. And over there is Bob Marks. We started in sort of you can tell this is live. Say hello, Bob.
Hey, Mark, how are you doing?
So far, so good.
Yeah, good.
2024 may be the most consequential election, quite possibly in a lifetime, maybe in 100 years. And it's certainly true at the national level, but it's also true at the local level, we believe. So we're going to do an hour here or so to talk about what's on the ballot at every level. We've got some guests coming up. And also, this is a chance for us to give you a heads up about our live election night show. We'll be on from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, a live stream, and lots of guests, lots of candidates, lots of winners, maybe even a few losers, other than Bob and me. Bob, let's talk a little bit about this election. You've been doing this a long time. Have you seen a campaign year quite like this one?
No, I think this is the most fascinating campaign I've ever seen. It's had ups and downs and swaying back and forth. And, God knows what's going to happen on Tuesday and where that's going to lead us on Wednesday and, for days or weeks to come. So the race continues to look very, very close. I think all of the things that I look at, all the markers, the polling to some extent point towards a narrow Trump victory. But on the other hand, the argument that some Democrats are making is that Trump is doing better in blue states like California, Illinois, and New York, and therefore his electoral college advantage will be greatly diminished. You could see like a reverse of 2016, where Harris wins narrowly in the Rust Belt states and becomes the next president. So it's still very much up in the air.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't do Trump much good to do well in California because he can't do well enough.
Exactly.
Given the blue nature of this state. It's an interesting point, though, which is certainly locally, and I think even around the state, you're seeing more overt behavior by Trump supporters. It's almost like they feel more empowered, more emboldened, I suppose. And 4 years ago, if there were Trump voters here, they pretty much kept to themselves. And it's almost like they're adopting sort of the defiant attitude that the top of the ticket tends to show. Yeah, this is who I am. And if you don't like it, tough.
Yeah.
It's a funny campaign message.
It is. And I think that...
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Having lived through the Reagan era, who was Mr. Sunshine, it was all about it's morning again in America. Trump's whole message is it's doom again in America. And it's hard to imagine somebody consistently winning on a message that's so negative. Well, and in fact, he has not won
right.
Vote and lost a couple of midterm elections pretty substantially.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why so negative works right now is the country's very uneasy. They're not happy, higher prices. There's obviously great concern about the border, whether that's legitimate or not. It's there. And so I think in this case, his anger helps him. I also think as far as his supporters, I think the end of the Harris campaign, calling Trump Hitler, fascist, and Biden calling garbage and all that, just further motivates Trump supporters to really get out there. But there's no question there's more people willing to stand up and say, hey, I'm for Trump. Yeah. That wasn't the case in the past.
Well, it's almost as though both sides have this passion and this conviction that they're right, no matter what the other side says. Right. There was an interesting piece in the New York Times this week about how many people are energized by his rhetoric and how many choose to ignore it. And I know on the national Sunday talk shows, people who are responding to something that Trump may have said, particularly hyperbolic, will say, well, that's just him. He just he uses hyperbole. Don't pay attention to what he says. Just pay attention to what he does, which is an odd political stance to take.
Yeah.
But that's one of their sort of unofficial messages is don't worry about all the stuff he says. What's interesting is, so people who are for Trump say things like the economy was better under him.
Mhm.
In reality, it was not. And now some of that's due to COVID, but better for whom? And that's the interesting question. There's such a funny dichotomy. I mean, you know this as well as I do, that that the states that consume the most government services tend to be the ones that vote to cut government services and cut taxes. It's always been an odd dichotomy anyway. And I guess that's more driven by distrust of government.
Yeah. When people say about the economy, we're not talking about the economy. We're talking about prices.
Right.
And that's really, if Trump does win, that's really the dividing line and why he'll win. A lot of people who don't like Trump, I know people who have hated Trump since the first day he came down that escalator, but they're going to vote for him because they're concerned about Kamala Harris. They're concerned about the direction of the country. So it is an interesting situation. Rarely do you have people who really dislike a candidate actually voting for him.
Well, and it's an interesting thing. You and I both know the way government works. It's unlikely that anybody can push the government and the country too far in one direction, with the possible exception of Trump, who almost performs more by sheer force of personality than even a particular. He really doesn't have a policy position. He doesn't have a policy philosophy, I should say. And on that note, we're happy to welcome on our old friend, our good friend, I should say, Melissa Michelson, who is the political science professor at Menlo College, in addition to dean of the School of, is it Applied Arts and Sciences? Have I got that right?
Just arts and sciences. You can apply them or not. That's optional.
Welcome. I should warn you, Bob has just projected and actually called the election for Trump already while you were.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah.
Listen, you got a 50-50 chance, so place your bets.
Yeah.
It's so close.
We're just talking about sort of the general nature of this campaign, certainly unlike anything we've ever seen, maybe the most consequential of our lifetime or beyond. What's your feel for this election, this campaign?
Yeah, the stakes are huge. I'm not sure to what degree people really appreciate how different America will be if Kamala Harris wins or if Donald Trump wins. It's a crossroads election, and things are going to be very different depending on who wins. And given that the stakes are so high, it is causing a lot of folks to lose sleep, including myself, that it is so close, and that really you can see whatever you want in the tea leaves, because all the various means we have as political scientists of predicting the election give us anything from a 75% chance of a Trump win to an 80% chance of a Harris win.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One thing that's true, Melissa, is there's more polling this time around than we've ever seen before, and it's all over the lot. And clearly, I've noticed 2 or 3 sites that are really good for Republicans and 2 or 3 sites that are really good for Democrats. And when I say that, they're so far out of the mainstream of polling that we've seen. So it is very hard to read this election. And what I'm saying is it could go either way, but the things that I'm looking at tell me that Trump is going to win. In 2020, Trump was an incumbent and he lost. This time around, we have a different incumbent. And I think his vice president may not be successful, but I would agree.
Let me ask you both this
it's
question.
up in the air.
We have seen.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what you're looking at besides the polls, but political scientists are looking at models, and the models are all over the place. So it's, polls are just one tool that political scientists use to try to predict election outcomes. There's also retrospective voting models, prospective voting models, mass models, naive models. There's a lot of jargon in there, but the point is that there's a lot of different tools that political science have
Right.
has shown are good ways of predicting outcomes. And yet it's over here, it's over here.
Yeah.
And so just makes it so hard to know. I would say the best advice I'm giving people right now is it's too close to call. Stop worrying about that and do whatever you can to help the person you want to win, because you won't regret that, but you're not helping by stressing out.
Yeah.
So
No,
let me
I agree with you. But I'm looking at all those models. I've been watching this closely for over a year on a daily basis. So I may have just gone over the edge, over the bend. But the other thing that I look at is body language.
Over the edge, yes.
Yeah. I look at body language of the two campaigns and the surrogates that are around them. And what I've seen over the last 3 weeks is body language that indicates great stress on the part of the Harris campaign, perhaps too much exuberance on the part of the Trump campaign. So you could read whatever you want into that, but you're right. There are a lot of things that go into trying to analyze this.
I watch Trump and think he looks actually like somebody who's kind of desperate. So in many ways, his body language to me is someone who's like frantic. And I know some of it is just that's the nature of the late in the campaign. Let me ask you both this, starting with Melissa. Clearly, the last messages have been, see if we can't break this deadlock. We've seen campaigns, elections where very late in the campaign, there is a surge to one side or another.
Yeah.
And clearly, it seems to me, both candidates are trying to drive that by what they're saying. Do you have any feel for, how this might happen? Because I have been skeptical all along. I mean, the newest poll I saw showed a 2% undecided. One of the questions, I guess, is how can anybody be undecided at this point? But on the other hand, I think some people are. Generally, I think they are probably Republicans who have never voted for a Democrat before and don't find Trump acceptable, but can't bring themselves to vote for somebody on the left.
I think there's a couple kinds of folks who are being recorded as undecided at this point. And we don't want to confuse undecided with, not paying attention or uninformed, right? These are people who are conflicted, right? Honestly conflicted. So it could be somebody who considers themselves a Republican. They personally don't like Donald Trump for some reason, something he's done or said, but they have a really strong partisan affiliation. And so they're having trouble saying they're going to vote for Trump, but maybe in the end they are going to go with Trump because that's their partisan affiliation. And it's even harder to imagine themselves voting for a Democrat. You might have folks who normally consider themselves Democrats, but there's something about Kamala Harris that doesn't sit well with them, or they're just really upset about how things have gone under the Joe Biden administration. And so they're not ready to say they're voting for Harris, but maybe their partisanship eventually pulls them over there. Or maybe you're a Republican who cares a lot about reproductive health. And so now you're considering voting for Harris because of the Dobbs decision. But again, your partisan identity is making that hard for you. So I think there's people that are going to fall both ways. They're the strongest predictor we have of vote choice, even better than asking people who they're going to vote for, is partisan identification. Because in those last days, people tend to come back to the party. And so on both sides, the candidates are trying to reassure those undecided folks, it's okay. We're your party. We're your people. Come on back. And most of those people will come back to their party.
Well, I mean, if you go solely by registration numbers, that would be good news for the Democratic ticket because there are just more of them. But we'll see.
We'll see.
I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit now to some of the local stuff on the ballot. And we're being joined now by our friend Don Cecil, who's a long-time political consultant, public affairs consultant, spent a lot of time waist deep in the morass of local politics. And yet he seems somewhat no worse for the wear. Don, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to join everyone. And Mark, it's the power of suppressed memory syndrome that allows me to be here today.
Yeah. Never forgetting for every 2 years, you forget how bad it was 2 years ago. That's great.
Absolutely.
We were just talking about how closely divided the nation is. It's not exactly a late-breaking bulletin, but has any of that sort of conflict, that disagreement, that disagreeableness manifested itself in local elections, Don?
It's a good question. And I think the easiest answer to it is yes, of course. But then I have to stop myself because we've always had people who have been disagreeable or not afraid to say things that might be perceived out of the mainstream. I think what has changed and is attributable to the last decade or so of national politics is the way in which things that would have mattered before, that would have immediately caused someone to be vilified or even result in them, dropping out of a race, they just don't rise to the level of the average voter having a reaction to it that this is so unacceptable. So I think the behavior's always been there. We can probably find anecdotal evidence that the behavior has increased, or people are running for office who might be a little bit angrier or a little bit comfortable sharing things that would otherwise have been unacceptable before. But it's the acceptance of the unacceptable that I think has increased in the minds of the average voter, unfortunately.
Don, we're seeing, maybe it's inside baseball, but we're seeing a battle between what I'll call establishment Democrats versus progressives. Certainly it's coming to the forefront in South San Francisco. And I guess the question is, where's all this headed from your perspective?
Boy, right into the frying pan here with this panel. Bob, I think when I think the race that you might be referring to in South San Francisco, let's go back to November of 2020. And at every level, we had this unprecedented perfect storm of a global pandemic, of the murder of George Floyd, of the outrage that came with that murder and however many other unacceptable, unconscionable things, the rise of, the spotlight on equity and oppression. And you also had some candidates who were not comfortable campaigning in the midst of a global pandemic. So it was a perfect storm that brought some really interesting, mostly younger, mostly progressive voices to elected office in San Mateo County. Of course, we had James Coleman in South San Francisco, unseating a longtime incumbent. You had Lizette Espinosa Garnica in Redwood City, unseating an incumbent there as well, although that was the first time that race was in a district model. I think what I'm looking for 4 years later is, thankfully, we don't have a global pandemic. All of the oppression still exists, but it isn't manifesting itself on us all collectively watching a man be murdered on TV in front of us. Trump is back. So in those 4 years, how will these candidates do now that they're the incumbent? Will they run a good race? Will they raise a lot of money? Will they collect endorsements? And keeping with your example of what we're seeing in South San Francisco, I think I just saw a post on social media that James Coleman has the endorsement of the South San Francisco Firefighters Association. Like, talk about the establishment.
Yeah.
So when the outsider becomes the insider, how does that change things or not?
Let's talk a little bit about these local races. We mentioned the South City race. What other local races are you particularly interested in seeing how they turn out on election night?
How much time do we have, Mark?
It's a busy ballot, isn't it?
It is. It's a very busy ballot. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is probably the busiest ballot we've seen because of the impact of district elections.
Yeah, I agree.
And what I find fascinating about district elections is, in some instances, it has led to more competition. And in other instances, it seemingly has led to less competition. That you would have a race in the city of Menlo Park go uncontested, and there's a single candidate who filed in a district, no one else filed, and they're essentially the council member elect. You have the same thing in the city of San Mateo. In San Mateo, you've got a hotly contested district election, and then you have another district where the heir apparent to that seat does not have a challenger. Now, one can say that this individual did such a great job on an issue of such importance to the residents of that district. Why would they look anywhere else? But I don't have a clear sense of how district elections are really shaking out in San Mateo County or the Bay Area. In some ways, it has increased democracy, and in other ways, I think it remains to be seen.
Well, I think you have to give these things time to filter down. If you're in a city that has only recently gone to district elections, and traditionally candidates have all come from one part of the city, which is now just one or two districts, it's going to take some time for residents in those other districts to see themselves as potential candidates. And so I think part of the reason we have these uncontested seats is that these are parts of cities where folks haven't generally been in the running to run for office. They're not from the right neighborhoods where they would have a shot at a citywide office. And so I think this is kind of the growing pains for the impacts of district elections. But it is disappointing when someone doesn't have a challenger. Nobody thinks that that's a healthy democracy when somebody runs unopposed.
Well, you make an important point. It isn't just that they come from neighborhoods where they may not have been encouraged, even involved in prior, even in government, but they're also probably coming from communities where they weren't encouraged to think about running for office at all. That it was like, this isn't your place. The phrase we hear, it's not your turn, which of course is absurd. If you wait your turn, you can wait a long time. There are no turns. You take your turn whenever you want it. But so that's interesting, Don. You mentioned a couple of races. There's one race in San Mateo, plus there's Measure T, the measure that would remove some of the constraints on high density, high-rise development there. Any other races you're watching closely?
Well, I think, Mark, just to tie up the district elections and how it's influencing what I'm watching, and then I'll answer your question. What I do think district elections have the ability to produce is incumbency remains an important factor in re-election and success, right? If you're the incumbent, there are inherent values and benefits that come with that. Being an incumbent in a citywide race is impactful. I'm interested to see how, let's stick with South San Francisco. So now that James Coleman, the sitting mayor of the city of South San Francisco, is running for election as an incumbent, but those districts are very small. And running in a smaller district inherently increases the value of what I just call sweat equity. So you still want to raise money, you still want to collect endorsements, you want to, do those traditional campaign elements and fund your digital buys and do your direct mail. But going from having to walk an entire city, knocking on doors or making phone calls, to 1/5 of that city just increases the power. If you're a candidate that has little funding or no funding, but you make the time to knock on every door 3 or 4 times and hopefully get that person to answer it once, there's real power in that interpersonal human connection. And I'm interested to see, is that going to benefit a challenger against an incumbent in whatever city that might take place? Because, the power of voters aren't necessarily happy that you're knocking on their door, but I think they always respect the fact that you've taken the time to put yourself out there and do something that most people would just not want to do. And that's essentially cold call with your knuckles to see if somebody's home to give a pitch on why you think you're the best candidate in the race.
We have all known candidates for whom campaigning in person has not necessarily been a positive result. But real quickly, because we want to move on to a next guest, but not that we don't want you to stick around, Don. But any other races that you think are kind of be important or bellwether or upsets or interesting?
I mean, interesting, right? Is I'm watching the Los Alamitos Elementary School District Board of Trustees. I'm watching lots of races, let's be clear, but to try to bring the obscure and interesting into this conversation. So we recently had a very high profile locally teacher strike. The teachers went on strike in the Los Alamitos Elementary School District. Now, this is a place that you think of as affluence, highly educated, great test scores. And I'm interested to see, does that strike benefit in any way the challengers of the current incumbents? Are people going to blame the incumbent school board members in some way, whether it's real, perceived, valid or not, for that teacher strike? And does it benefit the challengers?
Yeah. Well, Don has agreed to be on election night, so we'll closely track the Los Lomitas School District results when we do that. Thank you, Don, for being here. We'll see you election night, and I hope you have a good evening on that night.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Don.
We're happy to now be joined by Jim Hartnett, former CEO and Executive Director of Samtrans and Caltrain. Before that, longtime member of the Redwood City Council and former mayor. Jim, I don't know if you've had a chance to monitor some of this conversation, but the same question goes to you. Let's start with the question about district elections and how that plays out in this particular cycle.
Well, first, Mark and Bob, I want to say congratulations on the game and coming back. Looking forward to your election night and your regular series of the game. It's going to be great for the community.
Thank you.
Yeah, district elections, I'm not a big fan of. I agree with Melissa. It's going to take time to see how they turn out. And I think Don's comments about the advantage of incumbency in a district, whether that holds now for district elections as compared to citywide elections, is going to be interesting. Redwood City is a 7-member council. 4 seats are up. 2 of the districts, there's no contest. And one of those seats is held by a very solid person who was originally appointed to the council because someone got elected and left before the end of his term. Interestingly, that person who got elected and left before the end of his term also ran uncontested in his district. And he moved to that district in order to run. So it's pretty interesting.
Shenanigans, political shenanigans.
Well, good for him. He was interested in doing it, but his commitment to the district was pretty thin. His commitment to the city was pretty thin. And I think, I just hope that over time things balance out, that there will be contested elections in each of the districts in the normal course. I'm a fan of uncontested elections when I'm the candidate. And then it's nobody else's turn but mine, right? So, but there's real power in contest. It creates more attention, focus, and better policy. But, it's upsetting to me in Redwood City where we have 4 seats up and only 2 are being contested. And it's going to be a good test on the incumbency issue. 1 is being contested with the sitting vice mayor, an opponent who ran against her last time in a 3-person race. And so that's going to be very interesting. They're both, I know, working very hard in their campaigns. I think there's a lot of shoe leather that's going into the running. I don't think money is an issue in it. It's not an issue of mailers. I think it's an issue of, Don had talked about, is really the sweat equity. And that's going to be interesting. Particularly in that district, the incumbent lost to the current member, Lizette, and lost in a 3-person race. And if you totaled up the bottom 2, they exceeded the winner in terms of number of votes. So you never know how a 2-person race is going to turn out. But it's also interesting It illustrates to me an issue and the challenge of the city councils these days, who routinely rotate the mayor's seat. It used to be that you just, if you're a 5-member council, you got it, 3 people had to vote for you to be mayor. 7-member council in Redwood City, 4. And there's an advantage to the council selecting the mayor when it's not directly elected, because they're selecting somebody who they think is going to represent the city well, and is going to have their trust and confidence, because the mayor is able to do some things that individual council members are not. Now, we have in the district where Lizette is the incumbent. If she wins again, according to the normal rotation that the city council has now enacted, she'll automatically become mayor. It'll be a vote, but they have a routine now. And so you're going to have, in that case, a person who doesn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, who intentionally so, who's a declared socialist, who is going to be representing the city of Redwood City in its entirety in the seat as mayor, not just running meetings. There's more influence that a mayor has than that. So, that's a consequence of both district elections, and I think councils not having the will to just select the best person to represent the city on behalf of the council as the mayor.
Jim, you're a Redwood City resident for a long time. The supervisorial district that you live in has the only really competitive race that's going on in the county. Any sense about Lisa Gaudier versus Antonio Lopez?
That's a great question. And, I'd like to revert back to what Melissa said. I don't know, it's
Come on, go out on a limb, make a prediction.
Yeah, they're both working very hard. In the traditional sense, based upon how the June, the prior ballot went, Lisa was far ahead. She didn't get 50% plus 1, which if she had gotten that, she would have been in just as Jackie Spear did in her district, and would not then have had to run in this November ballot. So she had a really big lead, though. She didn't hit 50%. But now that it's down to 2 people, and Antonio, her colleague on the East Palo Alto City Council, has an exorbitant amount of money. He's apparently using it effectively. I get lots of mailers from both of them. And he's riding the wave of progressivism, and Lisa is looked at more as an establishment candidate. If you look at the endorsements that each of them have, Lisa's tilted towards what you call the establishment. But in traditional terms, neither one of them is, and Lisa is not a right-wing person. She's a moderate to left-leaning, and Antonio's considered, I think, left and left, but neither one of them is widely crazy. So in terms of the difference between them, whichever one took the seat, there'd be differences around the edges probably. And Antonio may have higher ambitions. He's not had a job yet. He's a PhD candidate. He got in the city council as with his life experiences. He's a very interesting person. But one would expect that his destiny, perhaps in his eyes, is beyond the Board of Supervisors.
Can I circle back to the conversation about rotating the mayors? Because
yes.
I hear what you're saying about how that maybe doesn't work out great in certain ways. But, let me play the devil's advocate, at least to argue for why I think it maybe is a good idea, which is related to the whole point of district elections, right? So if you're from a particular neighborhood that has tended not to have much of a voice, and folks from your neighborhood never got elected in at-large elections, but now finally with district elections, your community has a voice, has a seat. The rotating mayor plan means that at least once in a while, in fact, your neighborhood will be above, will get a little bit more love, will be the focus of more attention because your candidate, your representative is the mayor. And so I feel like the same sort of equity that is generated by district elections, that's then moved on to equity in the kind of executive leadership of a council mayor system, that your district holds the mayor's seat once in a while. And
Yeah,
as you said, they'll only get it if the voters from Lizette Espinosa Garnica's district reelect them. And so, you know, it's not completely random that they would get to be mayor. It's that they were elected, they were reelected, and now it's that community's turn to be in the mayor's seat.
yeah. You know, I recognize that argument. I think it's a great argument. I just don't think it holds water. I think you need to earn it. It's not a question of equity as to who becomes mayor. I think you should earn it. You know, first of all, in Redwood City, 6/7 of the people will not have had a chance to vote for you because of district elections, you know, in 7 districts. And so when it's a 5-member council, you know, 80% of the populace doesn't get a chance to vote for, you know, all the other candidates. And so, you know, it's not equity. It's who is going to represent the city best. You know, and it kind of a council, you look at it as kind of the republic. You have 7 or 5 members who represent the whole city and are exercising their wisdom in terms of who they think of their colleagues would best represent the city as mayor, best conduct the meetings, best work with city staff, best work with all the stakeholders, and do you proud. And so, you know, earn it. What's the matter with that?
Well, it's worth noting when you're mayor of a city here in San Mateo County, there's a council of mayors that meets and makes appointments to a good number of countywide and regional boards. So there is a difference, and it's one of the interesting challenges that still hasn't played out with district elections, which is how parochial will they be? Balkanized is a word I believe I heard just this week. And how much will they understand that their responsibility is to represent the entire city? And in particular, when you're mayor, that's sort of almost forced on you. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm happy to see the two of you battle this out, but it is a different position because of that. And the expectations are, you know, when people are unhappy about a street light going out in their town, on their street, they call the mayor. They don't necessarily call the person who represents their district. So it's a different responsibility. We're going to leave that further debate for election night. Jim Hartnett, thanks for being with us. Jim will be joining us on election night as well. Thank you for your time. And I want to mention again that we will be live streaming from 8 to 11 on election night. Bob, Melissa, and I will be there along with the guests you've seen already, plus a host of other people. Brought to you by the San Mateo Daily Journal, the Almanac, and Redwood City Pulse. So if you don't get tired of us now, you'll have a chance on Tuesday night. Speaking of which, we're happy to welcome on a couple of people who will be guests on election night as well. Julie Lynn, who is leads the San Mateo County Central Labor Council, who's joined by her close advisor and confidant, Cassidy. Hi, Cassidy. Thank you for being with us. Did you have a good Halloween? What were you dressed as for Halloween? Oh, you may be muted. You need to check that. Well, anyway, we also have John Mays here. John, the editor of the San Mateo Daily Journal. Hi, John.
Hi there. How are you?
Good. So we've been talking about district elections and how they may play out. Before we get into that conversation, I'd like to ask each of you, starting with you, John. What are the races you know? People who may not know, John writes all of the endorsement editorials for the Daily Journal. So he has interviewed virtually everyone. And if he hasn't, Julie has, because the Central Labor Council endorsement is a critical endorsement if you're running for office. So John, which races do you think will be of particular interest for your team on election night?
Well, probably, you know, San Mateo's Measure T. I think District 2 in San Mateo for the city council is of interest. just because there's two non-incumbent challengers for that particular seat. Measure T has generated a lot of interest because it's a height limit issue. I think all of them, that's the interesting thing, is that all of them are pretty interesting overall. We don't really know for sure what the results will be. Sometimes they're a little bit less interesting if they're slam dunks, but a lot of these are in play. And so I think, it could sway it, all sorts of different ways. So I'm interested to kind of see what turns out on election night, at least after the first results. That will kind of give a good indication. Once those results come out at 8:10, that'll be a pretty good, we'll have a pretty good idea as to which way things will go.
Julie Lind, what about you? I know that the Central Committee, that labor is always heavily involved at every level. You're spending a lot of time on which races are really capturing the attention of you and your membership.
Sure. I would like to respectfully disagree with John in that I find slam dunk races to be very exciting because it means I have to work less hard on them. So please don't deprive me of that joy, John. It's GOTV weekend. I have very little left right now.
Okay.
She's all amped. She has had candy for breakfast and 11 Z's and lunch. So she is ready. All right. So the races where we are really focused are San Mateo for Nicole and for the height limits. We're also walking in Foster City, Daly City, South City, and Pacifica, and Redwood City District 7. We've had a lot of interest because when folks come in to volunteer with us, we have a variety of different geographical choices because we like to let them pick. They want to walk where they live. But the races I'm seeing the most excitement in and the bags that people take the most often are Pacifica. People take Pacifica because Pacifica we're walking for both our council candidates and for other candidates up the ticket. But no, folks are grabbing a lot of bags for Nicole in District 2, and a lot of Daly City is going out, and South City in D2 and 4. Folks are excited about those. Those are the bags in the lit that I'm moving the most rapidly. So that's where we are focused. But we're also this year, we typically, apparently very boring. So we typically just do the field, the physical field, the phone banking and the precinct walks. This year we were a little bit different. We did the precinct walks only. The phone banking we did pushes into congressional swings in partnership with our Labor Federation. But we also did a whole heck of a lot of independent expenditures, which is not something that we've done in the past. We've done one or two. This time we did between mail, text, and robo, we did, maybe 30. So we're trying to counter the volunteer fatigue, which is my kind and political way of framing it. We're trying to combat the volunteer fatigue and also what seems to be the voter fatigue of having conversations with strangers at their door or via their cell phone, to really try to push out information in whatever way we can to talk to our community about who these candidates are and why working folks are supporting them.
You mentioned IEs, independent expenditure committees, which are, at least in theory, operating entirely independent of a candidate they may be supporting in one way or another. John, let me ask you about that, because we saw the emergence of IEs, it seems to me, at the biggest level ever in this county in a number of races. I've written in my column about the Committee for Jobs and the Economy, which is basically backed by the oil companies, and they've been heavily involved in the race for supervisor, also in the race for a seat in Belmont, because they're trying to oust an incumbent there who took some votes on regional air quality boards that they didn't care for. Have you seen this yourself, and are you concerned about the increasing influence of outside money or independent money, John?
I don't think it's anything new. I mean, we've had independent expenditures on a number of different races over the years. I think the oil companies is an interesting wrinkle to it, and it's definitely new. And that's the I guess could be an issue, is that you're talking about a district election in Belmont, and they're involving themselves in that because of a regional board that one of the council members is on. That's a little bit concerning overall. But I think, we've had it in the past, especially with rent control and rent control candidates or people who support rent control. The California Apartment Association and SAMCAR, San Mateo County Association of Realtors, and their California affiliate got directly involved with a lot of this stuff. And so I think overall it's it could be, that's just how it is, right? Everyone it's the First Amendment. Everyone has the right to do that. We've seen labor over the years get involved with, with flyers and things like that. And that's just, I think people, when you're talking about labor versus oil, big oil, right? I think people trust local labor leaders a little bit more than big oil companies. And so, if you're reading it and you say, okay, this is what labor does, or the Democratic Party or whoever else, it kind of makes a little bit more sense than oil companies getting involved in a small district election.
But that's why the oil companies are running it through a PAC with a different name. Because if you get a mailer that says sponsored by, whatever.
Citizens for a
Chevron,
Responsible Future or something.
Right. Citizens for a Responsible Future. That sounds way more like somebody I want to listen to than,
right.
Whatever, Pennzoil. So
yeah. And I think, obviously the Labor Council is the Labor Council when they send it out. So there's some transparency there. But you're right, there is a little bit of that. But what one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that this particular election has been pretty civilized locally, which has been interesting for me. It's not quite over yet, so I think I should knock on something. But compared to the last two elections in 2022 and 2020, overall, I think the candidates and their supporters are acting in a more civilized way than I've seen. There's been normal accusations and campaigning and that kind of stuff, but it's been less than what I've seen in the past. I don't really know why that is. Maybe everyone got sick of that and decided to be a little bit more civilized, or maybe just they wanted to counteract sort of what we're seeing at the national level by being a little bit more staid in their presentation to us, at least. So that's been a nice development for me. I like to see that continue.
John and Julie, you may want to comment on this also. Your paper had a front page story a few weeks back about pretty alarming increase in crime in San Mateo County, the largest increase in violent crime in decades, and in really large numbers of residential crimes, retail thefts, things like that. Is that something that's come up in either, John, your interviews with candidates, or Julie, as you talk to people? Is that an issue out there?
I mean, I think it is overall. It's not the primary one, but it's one of them. And just to be clear, the story you're referring to wasn't necessarily about the rise in crime. It was about the changing of attitudes about crime since 2020 to now. And we used some statistics that we had gathered for a previous story on retail theft and how it was on the rise. So, I think it is, public safety is generally a little bit more the forefront than it has been in the past. I think, but I think 2020 was a little bit different in that there was a huge amount of interest in social justice changes. And I think that it was more of a discussion point. It was definitely in the top 2 issues versus the top 5. But I think it still matters to people. Public safety is sort of, you feel it. If you're a victim of it, of a crime, you feel it a little bit more intensely. But it's definitely still resonating with people.
Julie?
And that is a big issue for us. And it's one that did come up in our interviews because there are a lot of misconceptions around retail theft, and also there's short-sightedness about its implications. So we saw an uptick in retail theft during COVID, largely as a byproduct of people weren't working. It was hard. People were taking desperate measures to care for themselves and their families. Baby, I need you to turn that down. But now retail theft continues. There's state legislation that has changed that makes the threshold for crime a lot higher. So you see this retail theft occurring more strategically to stay below what that threshold is. I can't remember offhand. For whatever reason, my
$950 from
so it's something like that. But sometimes it's people that are committing crimes of necessity, but that's really rare. It'll be this crew of high school kids with their backpacks running through. But in a lot of ways, it's like it sounds overly dramatic, but it's like an organized crime ring. These are retail, I'm going to call them goon squads, but these are organized groups of individuals that are going to our retail and grocery agencies or entities, hitting them and taking the stuff, because the security guards there are not going to chase them. Most companies have no chase policies, or people are cuckoo. I don't want to chase them because goodness knows what they're carrying. And you have that perpetuating, and that's leading to store closures. Not only is it dangerous for the people working in the store and the people shopping in the store if you have this crime occurring, but it's also, there have been a lot of stores in the like grocery and retail arena that have had to close down because of retail theft. They cannot make enough money to offset what is stolen from them every day, and they're closing down. People are losing jobs because of retail theft, and how active these squads of people that have made this their mission are, and how successful they are. Because law enforcement, relative to public safety, law enforcement is out doing what you traditionally think of as law enforcement policing. And they're not going to be just hanging out in the Safeway parking lot every day, making sure nobody does a smash and grab. So there's no really good answer to how do you combat retail theft. There's been some legislation at the state level that will help, but the candidates themselves, the best, for lack of a better term, answer was folks who had talked about, we are creating a special like study group within our police department. Our council is looking at ways to increase law enforcement presence, or to create other opportunities to work with law enforcement and with the retail unions to figure out how we can operate within the current environment and to really address and try to mitigate this.
Let's talk for a second. We referenced the independent expenditures by the other companies. There's, I think, probably a general consensus in this county that they don't want oil drilling off the coast. I mean, was a ballot measure many years ago that essentially banned any oil drilling related facilities being built on the coast side. But there is sort of a pledge that I think a lot of people have to take to get the Democratic Party endorsement, which they say they will not accept oil company money. How much of that do you think has resulted in these independent expenditures? Is that this is the only way for them to get into the game, since they can't give directly to people? John, what do you think?
Oh, is that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. Honestly, I don't know if people looking, if they're, it's possible, right? Like you put a rock in a river and the water goes around it. So yeah, it is possible that would give a rise to it. But I think it probably would have happened anyway in this particular race because of some of the decisions that one of the candidates is making at the regional level. And it's a full-on fight, it's an existential fight for oil companies. So I think it would have happened regardless if there's only so much you can give to a candidate, right? But you can spend as much as you want as an IE. So I think it would have probably happened regardless.
Let me ask you real quick. We were discussing this earlier in the show. Perhaps you heard us. Is the jury still out on district elections and how they manifest themselves? Are we still at a wait and see, or do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a perfect vessel, right? I understand the intention of district elections was to provide more opportunity for people of different backgrounds to run, and I think in that respect it's worked well. But there are some flaws, I guess, or some things that happen that long-term incumbents get out. You have two incumbents running against each other, but that's just sort of how it is, right? And so we just deal with that. But I think it evolves in time. People sort of figure out how to evolve in the right way. I think what may happen, what I would like to see happen, is having district elections with an independently elected mayor. So there is someone who is sort of the go-to person who touches on all the districts. I mean, because the quality of council members varies, right? So I would hate to have the idea that, my district representative, say I didn't vote for that person, or I didn't support that person, or that person somehow became distracted and no longer interested in helping constituents, it would be difficult for me or anyone else in that district to not to have someone else to go to. And so having a independently elected mayor, I think, provides the best of both worlds. And I kind of see that as a interesting hybrid. But as far as getting more people involved and engaged, I think it's good. The one problem that I saw in this particular election is that you can have 5 candidates running for 2 seats, right? And say in one district you have 2 very good candidates, and in the other district you have maybe not so much. And so if it weren't for district elections, you'd want to endorse those 2 in that one district, but you can't. So you pick one, and then maybe you endorse one that's not quite as good. So that's sometimes a situation where it's a little bit unfortunate. But on the other hand, just for every instance of that, you get someone or a group of people who would never have had a chance to engage in a citywide election or be successful. And so in that way, you get a more balanced council overall with different perspectives and different experiences. And some of the decisions and policy changes that the council comes up with reflect that representation. I think overall for our society, that's a positive.
I have to say, the level of quality in the candidates earns my award for the day as the most diplomatic statement you could say.
I'm known for that at times, right?
As the political scientist, I need to jump in and say switching from council mayor systems to strong mayor systems is a huge change to a city's charter. It's a shift from legislative dominated governance to executive dominated governance in a city. There's a reason that most smaller cities in California don't have independently elected mayors, and that most of them have the council mayor system. So as much as that might sound appealing, like on a surface level of, yeah, we should just have people vote for who they want to be the mayor, it means a totally different way of the city being run, where there's an executive
so let me just be
branch and a
clear. Let me just be clear. I wasn't suggesting a strong mayor. I was suggesting one of 5, but that person is the mayor, right? So you do get a little bit more sway because you are the one that is called to cut the ribbon and run the meetings. But I'm not talking about Oakland, and I'm not talking about San Francisco having a strong mayor, like the mayor is the executive.
How do you vote for mayor?
Right, but I wasn't talking about the mayor being the executive. I'm talking about the mayor being the chair of the council.
So
that's a little bit different than what you're
vote for
suggesting.
your district representative, but then you'd separately vote for which one of the folks you want.
No. So say, for instance, there's a 5-member council. You have 4 districts, and then you have one separately elected mayor, and that person represents. Julia. Yeah, exactly. So you have one person, or in San Bruno as well, you have one separately elected mayor who's elected every other year, or every 2 years. And then that person, what's that?
But elected by
the entire city, city. So that person is the sort of the figurehead of the city and has the ability to sort of connect with people from. I mean, all council members can do that, but it would be part of sort of the premise of that job. So I wasn't talking about shifting the city.
It sounded like sorry, I misunderstood you. That's my bad. I thought you were saying we should all switch to strong mayor cities, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah, no.
Here at the game, we all have misunderstandings. It's fine.
What's that?
Julie,
it makes it more exciting.
Julie, real quick, any thoughts about district elections, how they're playing out?
I find district elections to create lots more work for people working on elections. So now we get to have even more interviews for separate jurisdictions, which is fantastic. But I agree with pretty much everything that John said. I agree with having the Belmont, the San Bruno setup. You have the different districts broken out. You can work to ensure the entirety of your city is represented, but you also have somebody, even though all of them are charged with governing for the entire city, they tend to defer to their little baby fiefdoms. So if you have a direct elect mayor as well, at least you have somebody who remains continuously focused on continuity, though we do lose the amusement that often comes locally from the rotating mayor system. So John, that might negatively impact your readership if we had directly elected mayors everywhere. So just want to caution you.
I would like government to be less entertaining.
Just saying. But with the district elections, I think we need more time to see how they end up truly rolling in, because to John's point, yeah, it has created in a lot of places more diversity in candidates, because it's easier to walk a district that is a quarter of the city versus the whole dang thing. But then you have the problems where, okay, in just for purpose of argument, District 2, there are 3 great candidates. All of them would be wonderful. In District 1, nobody wants to run. So the political gadfly has stepped up and is unchallenged, and yay, you win. So there are still, I think, some kinks in the system, but the overarching goal of increasing representation, both geographic representation and ensuring our elected bodies are truly representative of our electorate, I think that the intent is good and the goal is important, but the execution is still pretty wobbly.
Yeah. John Mays of the Daily Journal, Julie Lind of the Central Labor Council, thank you for being with us. We will see you also on election night, but thank you for your time today. We'll continue to thrash out the district election between now and election day, I'm sure. Those are our guests. Any parting thoughts about the election, Bob?
Yeah, I have one. On election night, we're going to have Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, we're going to have Congressman Kevin Mullen, and Congresswoman Jackie Spear all on the show, along with Sam Liccardo, who's running to replace Eshoo. So it's going to be, I think we've got about 22 guests that are going to be on. And so it's something that I think people want to tune in.
Star-studded extravaganza.
Yeah,
I can't wait.
The lovely and talented Melissa Michelson will also be.
That's right.
Lower down on the billing, but I'm looking forward to it.
The rose among the thorns, is what I would think. It is. We will be live election night doing what we're doing here, but with more guests and with results. We'll be following a long list of elections, because this is the only place that's going to focus solely on what happens in San Mateo County. And we'll even talk about the presidential race because it would be irresistible. But we have, as Bob mentioned, dozens of guests coming on, people who are running for office. John Mays, Julie Lind, Don Cecil, Jim Hartnett will be on, members of the Board of Supervisors, and many of the candidates, some of whom are willing to come on even if they don't win. So that says something. I'm not quite sure what. But we will be here, brought to you by the San Mateo Daily Journal, Redwood City Pulse, and the Almanac. So that's it for us here now. I want to thank our friend Frank Bravo for being our producer. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Bob. I'm Mark Simon.
I'm Bob Marks.
And that's Melissa Michelson. You're watching a live stream of the game.
Thanks.
See
you on Tuesday.
And we'll see you on Tuesday night.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.